our chief audit executive has to make sure that the internal audit function is well managed, but it isn't just for the chief audit executive. This is going to be something that different people within the entire internal audit team should really care about, from the audit director to the audit manager or even the audit senior. Everyone is going to play a part in the management of the internal audit function. So let's look at this. So again, this is our third step within the different operational management steps of an internal audit function. And here we're going to look at making sure that it is properly managed. Let's look at the standards, these new standards from the Institute of Internal Auditors and Domain 3 governing the internal audit function. I really recommend that you go through these standards, and particularly Domain 3 on governing the internal audit function for the CIA Part 3. So the chief audit executive must make sure that internal audit adds value. And you might think that this is just empty words. Oh, yes, of course it's supposed to add value, but there are actually some obligations behind this, such as saying that it should fulfill the charter's responsibilities. Now, you have a mission within the Internal Audit Charter, which is to provide insight, assurance, and we're supposed to make sure that these are actually properly taken care of. We have to make sure that the internal audit function adds value also by following the standards. This is where you can benchmark against the standards. Now, you're supposed to do that within the internal audit quality and assurance and improvement program. We are complying with all the different parts of the Institute of Internal Auditors standards or other standards that your internal audit function might have adopted. We have to make sure that the auditors comply with the code of ethics. And I'm going to say that any breaches here can be greatly damaging to the reputation of the entire internal audit function, even though it might have just been one member out of a much larger team. But this is how you can lose trust in an internal audit function if you fail to comply with some of the, particularly on the integrity part of the code of ethics. Finally, internal audit adds value through strategic alignment. What does this mean? That means that we don't just have a task list of things to do. We actually have assessed the risks in this particular organization. And we understand that these are the things that our senior management, that our board of directors are going to care about. And so we are going to look at these in detail. These are the things that will help the organization best achieve the goals that it has set out for itself. One failure that I've sometimes noted in departments is that a big goal of an organization is to actually generate financial returns for its stakeholders. If an internal audit function is also failing to look at that particular aspect, then maybe it doesn't have the best strategic alignment. What I see is internal audit functions are great at looking at compliance with laws and regulations, but are they really looking at the thing that the board of directors and senior management care about deeply? And I'm going to say that this is something that you assume as always proper, and yet I feel is often improperly performed in so many internal audit functions. And so from that strategic alignment, you're supposed to have a risk-based internal audit plan and even risk-based internal audits themselves. Internal audit is definitely a function that is supposed to be looking at risk the entire time and use a risk-based approach. We're supposed to improve governance, risk. Now, the Institute of Internal Auditors says governance, risk, and controls. But usually when you use this acronym, you're going to be using the one that actually has been promoted since over 20 years by a completely different organization, OSEG. That's OCEG. And this organization has indeed been promoting the concept of governance, risk, and compliance. And governance, risk, and compliance is a slightly different concept to the one that the Institute of Internal Auditors has. We have to improve the governance part. So we actually need to see how our board of directors, our senior management, is setting out the different structures and processes to make sure a proper management of everything in the organization, which will allow it to achieve its objectives. So that's the governance part. That we have the risk management part properly under wraps to make sure that our risks to the achievement of objectives are properly managed. And finally, so our controls slash compliance, but it is compliance with control. So these are similar concepts where we make sure that all the compliance with laws, with regulations, with internal and external policies and procedures, and other things that help our organization achieve its objectives from a compliance point of view are properly dealt with in the organization. And finally, provide a relevant assurance to make sure that the internal audit function is adding value through the work that it performs. To control the internal audit activity, the chief audit executive should have a certain number of things in place. And these are control processes over the internal audit activities. First, we have our policies, processes, and templates that guide the activity, as we previously seen. Then we're going to have other things like mentoring and coaching the people within the internal audit team. Do not neglect this part. Of course, your internal auditors need to have the proper guidance, which will allow them to perform the work that they need to do. You, of course, should have a team that, can be trained to the level where they will be able to perform a work of sufficient quality. And if you don't have that, you have to look at internal or other external resources to complement that. But mentoring and coaching is a good way to get your own team at least to that level for the task that they are able to perform. Continual professional development to ensure that auditors are capable of performing their tasks and continue to develop new skills so that they can be performing new tasks in the future. If you are seeing your internal audit strategic plan, you're looking at that strategic plan and that in 12 months' time, you have a certain audit. Now, you believe and you know your team enough that you can develop your team to perform those internal audits, then you probably won't need to get external resources to actually supplement your team's skills, abilities, or knowledge if you can develop them yourself. And continuing professional development, either the CIA or other specific industry knowledge, are going to be important things that your internal audit team should know about. And then you're going to have certain detective and or corrective controls, things like peer review to ensure the quality of your audit work. So this is really going to be your supervision of the work of generally more junior people within your internal audit function. And the idea is to have, of course, a quality standard that are improved through review of the work, monitoring and reviewing of the progress to identify different problems. Now, you might have some things that are blocking an internal audit. Now, when I would have my team meetings, what I would always ask is, do you believe there is anything that is blocking the progress of our internal audits? That can even include the things that, or you don't know about, where I prefer someone telling me that they do not know how to perform a task so that we can find ways of mentoring, supervision, or guidance to help that person be able to do those particular tasks. And then you might have further things such as team meetings to review progress and solve team issues and also set out short-term objectives. So this is a directive control, which is going to help your internal audit team in the coming weeks or days get towards what they need to do. Supervision is an incredibly important thing within the entire process. We have full chapters and sections about supervision itself. You can also record the time. That's a kind of supervision of work time on particular tasks, and to make sure that there's a proper monitoring of resource usage. That would be normal. Looking at some other processes such as risk identification and management, This is where we are looking at the risks within the internal audit function itself. Why? Because the internal audit function itself has objectives, such as, well, providing that insight and that assurance that we talked about. And sometimes that can be risks that make it more difficult. These could be things like threats or pressure. These could be lack of access to information. This could even be lack of knowledge. In any case, we would need to identify risk within our own function, applying the medicine that we give to others to ourselves, and of course, manage these risks so that they are properly dealt with. So we can have a few preventive measures within this, such as segregation of duties. Understand, for instance, that you cannot have audit and non-audit tasks for staff that are not fully dedicated to internal audit work. So if someone is, say, aiding an internal audit function, let's say from the information security department, they wouldn't themselves be able to be writing the internal audit findings themselves. They might assist an internal audit team, but there should be a proper segregation of duties where the performance of the audit parts themselves are really performed by the internal audit teams themselves. So this is a kind of segregation of duties be between the maker, let's say, of a report or performance of an audit test, the auditor, and the reviewer, the audit supervisor. If the audit supervisor has been performing tests themselves, then they should actually ask someone else to verify this work. And it can sometimes go up to the chief audit executive in smaller functions doing some audits themselves. And look, I've asked even junior people in my team, still at manager level, to review my work to verify whether I might have made mistakes myself and to improve the quality. You could also have peer review if you're, say, reporting to a group internal audit function, or if you have other people that could help you in this process while maintaining, of course, the independence of the internal audit function.